In the last decade alone, India lifted roughly 171 million people out of extreme poverty, which, to put that in perspective for you, that is more than half the population of the United States, elevated above the absolute survival line in just a few years.
Yeah, it's a staggering number.
Right. But in that exact same time frame, the top 1% of the Indian economy captured so much wealth that domestic income inequality completely shattered historical records. I mean, the concentration of capital actually surpassed the levels seen during the peak of the British colonial Raj. So how do you trigger a historic, society-altering collapse in absolute poverty while simultaneously building one of the most extreme, entrenched oligarchies on the planet?
It's the central paradox of modern development, right? We
Right.
operate under this assumption that a rising tide automatically lifts all boats equitably. But the mechanics of economic growth are actually deeply asymmetrical.
Asymmetrical how, exactly?
Well, you can build a highly effective welfare state to ensure nobody starves, while simultaneously structuring your capital markets so that a tiny, tiny fraction of the population monopolizes all the newly generated wealth.
Which completely shatters the illusion that economic emancipation automatically follows political liberation. And welcome to today's deep dive. If you're commuting or prepping for a policy meeting or just trying to figure out how the global economic machining actually operates, we have a massive mission for you today.
We really do.
We are going to untangle the mechanics of global economic inequality and poverty reduction. And we'll use South Africa's post-apartheid transition as our anchor point. You know, a nation that completely dismantled its political oppression but found itself trapped by its economic legacy. And I think you'd agree, looking at South Africa in isolation only gives us half the picture.
Exactly. To understand why South Africa stalled, we have to stress test its trajectory against other massive, deeply unequal nations. I mean, we need to look at Brazil to see how they actually engineered a reversal of their inequality curve. We need to examine India's bipolar economy. And we have to look at the sheer civilizational scale of poverty eradication in China. You know, who bent the curve, who broke the scale, and who is still trapped by the architecture of the past.
But before we get into the mechanics of these economies, we need to establish a critical piece of housekeeping with you, our listener. We are going to be dissecting heavily charged historical policies, deeply sensitive racial dynamics, and highly polarized political rhetoric today, specifically regarding South African factions.
Yeah, it's a very complex landscape.
It is. So we want to state upfront and unequivocally, neither of us is taking a political side. We are not endorsing specific viewpoints, and we aren't condemning any political party. Our job today is to strictly and impartially unpack the sociological data, the macroeconomic trends, and, well, the policy outcomes from the sources we're analyzing.
And I think the overarching theme here is a harsh reality that applies globally, right? Changing a constitution is an act of political will. It can happen overnight.
Literally overnight.
But changing who owns the capital, who controls the land, and who holds the highly skilled jobs that requires dismantling an economic machine that was built over centuries.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to start with the baseline. South Africa, 1993, the eve of the first democratic elections. Nelson Mandela is preparing to take office. Politically, it's a miraculous transition. But if we take an economic x-ray of the country at that exact moment, the Gini coefficient was sitting at roughly 0.66.
Which is astronomical.
Right. Now, anyone who works with macroeconomic data knows that once you cross 0.60, you are operating near the absolute ceiling of inequality before a society essentially devolves into feudalism.
It is a stratospheric number. And, you know, it wasn't just the generic class divide. It was a legally engineered racial hierarchy. Interracial inequality accounted for roughly 61% of total inequality. Yeah. The white to black per capita income ratio was 15.7 to 1. But income is just the surface level. What's far more durable is the wealth disparity. In the early 1990s, the top 10% of the South African population held between 80% and 90% of all household wealth. The bottom 50% of the entire country had near zero or negative net worth.
And this is where we really have to reframe how we think about apartheid. It's often taught globally as a system of extreme social segregation, right? Separate amenities, lack of voting rights. But fundamentally, apartheid was a wealth extraction architecture.
It was an incredibly meticulous economic engine. Think about how wealth is actually generated in an industrializing economy. You need land, you need cheap labor, and you need to direct capital toward high-yield industries.
Yeah.
So the Group Areas Act forcibly removed black South Africans from economically viable land in urban centers. Then pass laws and the homeland system effectively turn those rural areas into holding pens, like massive labor reserves.
And then there's the Bantu Education Act, which I honestly find to be the most insidious part of the whole machinery. Because they didn't just underfund black schools. They literally designed a curriculum to cap a black child's intellectual development at the exact level required for unskilled manual labor on the mines or the farms.
Precisely. If you structurally guarantee that 80% of your population cannot acquire advanced skills, cannot unionize, and cannot live near economic hubs without explicit permission, you artificially suppress the cost of labor.
And that suppression allowed the highly formalized, white-owned mining and industrial sectors to generate massive profit margins.
Exactly. Those profits were then reinvested into elite, globally competitive education, infrastructure, and housing for the white minority.
So when the legal scaffolding was finally torn down in 1994, the political weather changed, sure, but the economic roots were completely twisted in poisoned soil. I've heard it described as a gated city.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
Yeah, for decades, the people inside the gates have been accumulating property, compound interest, university degrees. The people outside the gates have been deliberately stripped of assets and confined to poverty. So in 1994, the government announces the gates are open, segregation is over. But the people outside still don't have the capital to buy a house inside the gates. They don't have the skills to get the high-paying jobs.
And this gets to the crucial difference between the flow of income and the stock of wealth. Why is an economic legacy so stubborn? Because wealth reproduces itself. If you earn an income, you spend it to survive. But if you hold wealth, it compounds.
It buys property, stocks.
Right. It generates factor income. Dividends, rent, capital gains. Wealth buys property in appreciating neighborhoods. It buys access to private networks that secure future business contracts. So South Africa didn't just inherit a static snapshot of inequality in 1994. It inherited a self-replicating engine of compounding advantage.
Which brings us to the paradox of post-1994 South Africa. And we have to be absolutely clear here. The democratic government did not sit on its hands. The Mandela administration rolled out the Reconstruction and Development Program, the RDP. This wasn't just a policy document. It was a massive logistical attempt to deliver human dignity.
The scale of the RDP was staggering, really. They set out to physically build over 1 million subsidized homes, and they largely succeeded. They delivered around 1.1 million units.
That's incredible in that time frame.
It is. They electrified millions of households, rolled out clean water infrastructure, expanded primary health care. They took the old racially fractured social pension system and universalized it, which, laid the bedrock for the child support grant. That's a cash transfer system that keeps millions of people out of absolute starvation today.
But, and this is the paradox, despite pouring massive state resources into housing and grants, the underlying economic inequality actually grew. In the first decade of democracy, that Gini coefficient climbed from 0.66 up to around 0.69. It even peaked in the low 0.70s before settling back into the mid-0.60s. Pre-tax inequality hovered near 0.80. How is that mechanically possible?
That's counterintuitive, isn't it?
Very. How do you build 1 million homes and expand welfare but still end up more unequal?
Because you are fighting the compounding nature of the inherited market. The state was heavily redistributing wealth through grants, yes, but the formal economy was generating new inequality at a faster rate than the state could tax and transfer it.
And the nature of that inequality mutated, didn't it? The overall racial gap did narrow. I mean, the white to black income ratio dropped from 15.7 down to about 9 by 2019, but the interracial inequality was quickly overshadowed by a massive explosion in intra-black inequality.
Yeah, the legislative barriers to entry were removed, meaning a new black elite middle class could finally enter the commanding heights of the corporate sector and the state apparatus. Through policies like Black Economic Empowerment, or BEE, and public sector employment, a segment of the black population saw incredible wealth accumulation.
But the vast majority remained structurally excluded.
Exactly. So the racial hierarchy weakened, but the class hierarchy intensified.
Let's dig into the mechanisms of that structural exclusion, because there are 4 specific traps outlined in the sources that kept the majority locked out. First, labor market segmentation. South Africa's unemployment rate is currently sitting somewhere between 30% and 40%, depending on whether you count discouraged job seekers.
And economists often refer to this as an insider-outsider model. The South African economy is highly formalized and capital-intensive. The jobs that exist require high skills and are protected by strong labor laws and unions.
Which is great for the people who have them.
That's great for the insiders. But if you lack those skills, You are an outsider. You aren't just earning a lower wage, you are structurally blocked from participating in the economy entirely.
I'm struggling with the second trap, though, which is education. Because post-1994, the state poured billions into the education budget. Access was expanded universally. So why wasn't that enough to bridge the skills gap and pull those outsiders into the formal sector?
Well, because equalizing funding doesn't instantly equalize capacity. The former white schools retain their globally competitive standards, often supplemented by private fees from wealthy parents. But the township and rural schools, despite receiving state funds, were hampered by a legacy of underqualified teachers, poor infrastructure, and the socioeconomic trauma of the surrounding communities.
So the foundation was just totally uneven.
Yeah. Expanding access to a dysfunctional classroom doesn't produce the capital-intensive skills the formalized economy demands. It just produces a graduate who is statistically likely to join the ranks of the unemployed.
Which feeds directly into trap number 3, spatial geography. Apartheid's spatial planning wasn't undone by democracy. People still live where the old regime forced them to live on the peripheries of the cities.
And spatial geography acts as a daily, punishing tax on the poor. If you live in a township far from the urban economic center, a massive percentage of your potential wage is instantly consumed by the transport costs of just getting to a job.
Just the minibus taxi fare alone.
Exactly. The commute isn't just an inconvenience. It's a structural barrier to entering the labor market. If the cost of the commute exceeds the marginal benefit of a low-wage job, you simply drop out of the labor force.
And trap number 4 is the unmoved wealth concentration and the mechanics of elite capture. The ownership structure largely stayed intact. And policies like BEE, which were intended to empower the broad base of the population, well, they often functioned more like a pipeline for political patronage.
Yeah, you get this phenomenon of tenderpreneurship, where state procurement contracts are captured by the politically connected rather than utilized to build broad-based industrial capacity.
So all of this culminated in a massive macroeconomic pivot in 1996 that is still fiercely debated today. The government shifted from the state-led RDP to a policy called gear growth, employment, and redistribution.
Right, gear is a massive turning point.
But why did they pivot? You have a newly democratic state with a mandate to deliver, and suddenly they adopt a macroeconomic framework that prioritizes fiscal austerity, deficit reduction, and inflation targeting. It seems like a total 180.
You have to look at the global economic context of 1996. South Africa was facing a severe currency crisis. The rand was plummeting. The state realized it lacked the bureaucratic capacity to directly build and manage the economy at scale, and more importantly, they were terrified of capital flight.
Right, the bond markets.
Exactly. If global bond markets lose faith in a newly democratic, developing nation's fiscal discipline, they sell off the currency, bond yields spike, and the country can go bankrupt overnight.
So it's the ultimate macroeconomic trap. You're trying to rebuild a burning house, but you have to simultaneously negotiate with international insurance markets to prove the house is a safe investment.
That's a great way to put it.
And critics argue gear was a betrayal that sacrificed the structural redistribution required to fix the root causes of poverty, while defenders argue it was the only way to stabilize the economy and prevent a total sovereign debt collapse.
And the result of navigating that trap is what economists describe as Denmark versus Bangladesh, occupying the exact same geography.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
The top tier of the South African economy enjoys factor incomes, global integration, and a standard of living comparable to Denmark. The bottom tier, struggling with mass unemployment, fragile schooling, and reliance on state grants, navigates an economic reality closer to Bangladesh.
So South Africa essentially proved that you can't just hand out unconditional cash grants if there are no jobs to absorb the population. The tax base eventually cracks under the weight of 40% unemployment. But is it even possible to engineer job growth and mass welfare at the same time in a developing democracy?
Actually, yes. And we don't have to guess how to do it because Brazil pulled it off in the exact same decade.
Let's get into that, because the parallels between Brazil and South Africa in the 1990s are striking.
They really are. Both emerged from authoritarian regimes. Both had deep, historically entrenched racial stratifications. And both had world-leading Gini coefficients hovering around the low 60s. But Brazil managed to fundamentally bend their curve. By 2023, Brazil's Gini had dropped to roughly 51.6.
Wow.
Yeah, during the early 2000s, Brazil's inequality fell at double the rate of South Africa's.
Let's get into the mechanics of that, because the flagship program in Brazil was Bolsa Familia. It launched in 2003, and at its peak, it was reaching something like 13 million families, roughly 50 million people. But the critical difference between Brazil's grant and South Africa's grant is that Bolsa Familia was conditional.
This is a vital distinction in welfare economics. South Africa utilized unconditional transfers. If you meet the age or income criteria for an old age pension or a child support grant, you get the money.
No strings attached.
Right. Brazil took a different route. They provided cash to the poorest households, but they tied that cash to strict behavioral conditions. Families had to ensure their children attended school with a minimum attendance rate, and they had to comply with basic health checkups and vaccination schedules.
But mechanically, how do you track the school attendance of 50 million people in a developing nation with a massive informal economy? I mean, you can't just mandate that without an insane logistical backbone.
You're touching on the real genius of the Brazilian approach, which is the Cadastro Único, the Unified Registry. The Brazilian state undertook a massive decentralized effort, working with local municipalities, to literally go door to door and map out the informal economy.
Door to door, that is massive.
Yeah, they built a unified database of the poorest citizens. They issued electronic debit cards directly to the female head of the household, which ensured the money was spent on family welfare rather than diverted. The data integration between local schools, health clinics, and the federal treasury was unprecedented.
So they aren't just alleviating immediate poverty. They're structurally forcing human capital investment. You get cash today, but only if you are building the skills and health required to enter the formal labor market tomorrow.
Exactly. And economists estimate that Bolsa Familia alone was responsible for up to 28% of the total decline in Brazil's Gini coefficient during that era. However, and this is where South Africa's lesson comes back in human capital investment, is useless if there is no demand for labor.
Right, if there are no jobs.
Yeah, you can educate a child, but if the economy isn't generating jobs, you just have a healthier, better educated, unemployed person.
So how did Brazil solve the demand side?
They executed an aggressive labor market policy, specifically targeting the minimum wage. Throughout the 2000s, the Brazilian government continuously hiked the minimum wage well above the rate of inflation.
Wait, I have to push back there, because standard economic theory dictates that if you arbitrarily hike the minimum wage in a developing economy, you're going to destroy jobs. Employers will just fire workers or push them into the unregulated, informal shadow economy. So how did Brazil avoid that?
Because Brazil timed it perfectly with a massive China-driven commodity boom. The global demand for Brazilian soy, iron ore, and oil flooded the country with capital. The economy was growing rapidly, which meant businesses could absorb the higher wage floors.
Oh, okay.
Furthermore, the government actively utilized labor inspections to force businesses to formally register their workers. They essentially pulled millions of workers out of the shadows and into the formalized sector, providing them with legal protections and higher wages.
And that is what economists call predistribution, right?
Precisely. Redistribution is reactive. The market generates massive inequality, and the government tries to fix it after the fact by taxing the rich and giving welfare to the poor.
Right.
Predistribution is proactive. It changes the power dynamics of the market before the wealth is finalized.
So by hiking the minimum wage and formalizing labor, Brazil ensured that the working class captured a larger share of the initial economic output.
Exactly. It's the perfect synergy. Brazil married targeted conditional welfare with active labor market integration.
While South Africa provided the welfare, but the structural traps of education, geography, and an insider-outsider labor market kept the jobs out of reach.
Right.
But Brazil shows us what happens when a state balances the floor and the ceiling. What if a nation explicitly decides to tolerate, even accelerate extreme inequality at the very top, so long as it solves absolute poverty at the bottom? For that, we turn to the bipolar economy of India.
And India presents one of the most fascinating measurement paradoxes in modern economics. If you look at India through the lens of the World Bank's consumption surveys, it appears to be a highly egalitarian society. The consumption Gini coefficient in 2022 was an incredibly low 25.5.
Wait, really?
Yeah, that is lower than almost any Western European nation.
But consumption data is an illusion, isn't it? I mean, if you measure inequality based purely on what people buy at the grocery store or spend on rent, you are missing the entire architecture of modern wealth.
Exactly. Poor households have a high marginal propensity to consume. They spend almost every rupee they get just to survive, often heavily subsidized by the state. Rich households don't consume the vast majority of their income. They save it, invest it, funnel it into corporate structures, or hold it in appreciating equity.
So when you switch data sets and look at the World Inequality Database, which combines survey data with national tax records and macroeconomic accounts, a totally different India emerges.
An extreme oligarchy. The income inequality in India is staggering. The top 1% captures over 22% of the national income, and they hold roughly 40% of the total wealth. It's what economists are calling the billionaire Raj.
And this extreme ceiling was unlocked by the 1991 liberalization of the Indian economy, right? Prior to 1991, India operated under the license Raj, a heavily regulated, state-controlled economy that suppressed growth. When they liberalized, they dismantled the red tape, opened up to foreign capital, and unleashed the private sector.
But they did so without implementing a progressive taxation architecture on capital.
Mechanically, though, how does capital avoid taxation at that scale?
Through incredibly complex corporate structures, promoter holdings, and international tax treaties, like the famous Mauritius route, where foreign direct investment was routed through tax havens to avoid Indian capital gains taxes. Furthermore, India lacks robust wealth or inheritance taxes, so the capital accumulated at the very top just continues to compound, completely untouched by the state.
But here is the paradox that completely breaks your brain. During the exact same decade that the billionaire Raj was consolidating unprecedented wealth, India orchestrated a historic collapse in extreme poverty. Between 2011 and 2023, roughly 171 million people were lifted above the extreme poverty line. The rate plummeted from 16.2% down to roughly 2.3%. How do those two realities exist in the same geography?
Because the Indian state fundamentally changed the floor without touching the ceiling. They built a massive dual-pillar welfare architecture aimed entirely at basic survival. The first pillar is the public distribution system, the PDS.
Let's break down the mechanics of the PDS because it's not just a food stamp program, it's a massive physical logistics operation.
It is the largest food security program in the world. The Food Corporation of India buys millions of tons of wheat and rice directly from farmers at guaranteed minimum support prices. They store it in massive granaries, transport it across the subcontinent, and distribute it through hundreds of thousands of fair-price shops, heavily subsidizing the cost for roughly 800 million citizens.
800 million people.
Yeah. By guaranteeing caloric survival, they effectively put a hard floor under extreme poverty.
And the second pillar is MNREGA, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Now, this isn't welfare. This is a legal guarantee of work.
Right. It's a workfare program. MNREGA guarantees 100 days of paid, unskilled manual labor per year to any rural household that demands it. At the village level, a citizen gets a job card, goes to their local panchayat, the village council, and requests work. By law, if work isn't provided within 15 days, the state must pay an unemployment allowance.
I've heard it described as welfare with a shovel in its hand. But what kind of work are they actually doing?
Mostly physical infrastructure that benefits the local agrarian economy. So digging irrigation canals, building water conservation structures, constructing rural roads. But the true genius of MNREGA is that it acts as an automatic macroeconomic shock absorber.
Like if there's a drought.
Exactly. If there is a monsoon failure and crops die, or if there's a national economic downturn, the rural poor immediately demand MNREGA work. It prevents a localized crisis from spiraling into mass starvation. Furthermore, by guaranteeing a state wage, it forces private agricultural landlords to raise their own wages to compete for labor.
So if we compare this back to our South African anchor, South Africa's economy is like a cliff. You have a formalized sector at the top, a sheer drop, and millions of people entirely excluded from the labor market at the bottom, surviving purely on cash grants. India's economy is a barbell.
Yes, a barbell.
You have a massive weight at the bottom, hundreds of millions of people whose basic consumption is protected by food subsidies and workfare. And you have a massive weight at the top, the billionaire Raj accumulating equity at warp speed. And in between, a very thin, stretched middle class.
India proves that if you generate high enough aggregate economic growth, you can expand the fiscal space to fund massive logistical welfare. You can eradicate extreme poverty without ever confronting elite capture. Poverty reduction is a matter of state logistics. Inequality reduction requires rewiring the power dynamics of capital.
So India proved you can raise the floor while ignoring the ceiling. But if we want to talk about eradicating extreme poverty at a historically unprecedented, almost civilizational scale, we have to look at China.
The sheer math of the Chinese economic miracle is difficult to comprehend. Between 1981 and 2020, China lifted approximately 800 million people out of extreme poverty. To put that in a global context, China alone is responsible for roughly 70% to 75% of the total global decline in extreme poverty over the last 40 years.
It's insane. If global poverty were a sinking ship, China didn't just hand out life preservers. They physically rebuilt the ship while it was in the water. But they didn't do it through ideological purity. They did it through intense, ruthless pragmatism.
You can trace it back to Deng Xiaoping's famous pivot in 1978. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. China moved away from rigid Maoist central planning and initiated the era of reform and opening up. And they executed this in three distinct, highly orchestrated phases. Phase one was agricultural, the household responsibility system.
Let's explain how that actually worked, because they didn't just fully privatize the land, right?
No, the state retained ownership of the land.
Right.
But they dismantled the collective farming communes. They gave rural households long-term leases and instituted a dual-track pricing system. A farmer still had to deliver a specific quota of grain to the state at a fixed low price. But, and this is the revolutionary part, any surplus they produced above that quota, they were allowed to sell on the open market at free-floating prices.
So they instantly reintroduced the profit motive without immediately destroying the state's food security. Human effort suddenly translated directly into personal wealth.
And agricultural output skyrocketed. Hundreds of millions of farmers dragged themselves out of poverty simply because the state got out of the way and allowed them to capture the marginal value of their own labor.
Then we hit phase two, the 1990s and 2000s, the shift from rural farms to coastal factories. China creates these special economic zones, like Shenzhen. They treat entire cities as macroeconomic laboratories. They slash tariffs, streamline bureaucracy, and invite foreign direct investment.
And this triggers the greatest human migration in modern history. Hundreds of millions of rural workers migrate to the eastern seaboard to work in manufacturing. Now, mechanically, how did China keep labor costs low enough to become the workshop of the world? They utilized the hukou system.
What is that exactly?
It's a household registration system that ties a citizen's social welfare benefits to their rural birthplace.
So a rural worker moves to Shenzhen, builds iPhones, but legally they remain a rural citizen, which means the city of Shenzhen doesn't have to provide them with urban healthcare, pensions, or education for their children.
Exactly. It created a highly transient, incredibly cheap labor force that couldn't demand the expensive social safety nets that usually accompany rapid urbanization. And to connect these factories to global supply chains, China unleashed a civilizational-scale infrastructure build-out. High-speed rail, deep-water ports, massive power grids, heavily financed by local government debt vehicles.
And that infrastructure build-out turbocharged their entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. But even with all that macroeconomic growth, the market couldn't reach everyone. Which brings us to phase three, the 2010s to 2020. Targeted poverty alleviation, or TPA.
By the 2010s, broad market growth had lifted the vast majority. But there was a stubborn, entrenched core remaining. Roughly 100 million people living in deep poverty, mostly in remote, mountainous, or ecologically fragile regions. The market was never going to build a factory in a remote Tibetan valley. So the state pivoted from macroeconomic growth to hyper-targeted micro-intervention.
The logistics of TPA are mind-blowing. It was a literal, data-driven military campaign against poverty. They built a national database to identify exactly who was poor, tracking them down to the individual household. They determined why they were poor. Was it lack of infrastructure, chronic illness, or lack of capital?
Right.
And then they deployed over 3 million Communist Party cadres to actually live in these villages to execute the strategy.
They utilized state-backed microcredit, integrated remote villages into the national e-commerce grid so farmers could sell directly to urban consumers, and for the most extreme cases, they utilized physical relocation.
Physical relocation?
Yeah. The Chinese state literally built new cities and forcibly relocated nearly 10 million people from inhospitable mountainous regions into urban centers where they could access jobs and healthcare.
And by 2020, they declared the eradication of extreme poverty under their national standard. But I have to push back here, because this miracle comes with massive, undeniable trade-offs.
Severe trade-offs. The environmental degradation was catastrophic. They essentially built prosperity by burning mountains of coal, poisoning local water tables and air quality. Economically, while they eradicated absolute poverty, their wealth inequality surged, creating a billionaire class that rivaled the U.S. And politically, this entire architecture relied on an authoritarian monopoly on power. The relocation of 10 million people was not a voluntary democratic process. It involved intense coercion.
Which raises the ultimate question. Is the Chinese model even replicable for a democracy like South Africa or India? Because China's success relied on authoritarian bureaucratic discipline, the ability to violently suppress labor organizing, and the capacity to execute a 40-year economic strategy without a single electoral disruption. A Democratic president has 4 or 5 years before they face the voters. You can't forcibly move 10 million people in a democracy, and you can't easily pilot a 20-year infrastructure plan without the opposition party tearing it up halfway through.
That is the central tension of modern development economics. Authoritarian state capacity can bulldoze through structural traps and execute massive logistical feats, but at a severe cost to human rights, civil liberties, and ecological balance. Democracies preserve those liberties, but they often lack the ruthless, centralized coordination required to execute structural transformation at that scale. They are beholden to the slow, messy process of building consensus.
Right. Authoritarian regimes can force a 30-year economic timeline. But what happens in a high inequality democracy like South Africa when that structural transformation stalls? When the unemployment rate doesn't budge from 40%, the spatial geography remains fiercely segregated, the wealth remains concentrated, and politicians still have to face the voters every 5 years.
When policy fails to deliver material change, rhetoric inevitably fills the void.
And before we move into this final section, we absolutely must reiterate our impartiality. We are analyzing the sociological and political texts provided to us. We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing or condemning any political faction. We are looking strictly at the mechanics of political speech within a fractured society.
The material focuses heavily on the rise of populist rhetoric in South Africa, particularly examining Julius Malema, the leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF. The text heavily scrutinizes his repeated use of the chant Dubul Ibhunu, which translates directly to kill the Boer or kill the farmer.
Now, the defense from Malema and his political base is that this is a historical struggle song. It stems from the anti-apartheid movement. They argue it is meant to be a symbolic expression of legitimate anger against the ongoing legacy of land dispossession, not a literal tactical call to pick up a weapon and commit violence today. But the legal system is totally fractured on how to handle it. The Constitutional Court has, at times, protected it under the umbrella of historical expression, but lower equality courts have ruled specific instances of the chant as explicit hate speech.
And this rhetorical battle is not happening in a vacuum. It is occurring against a backdrop of very real, visceral violence in rural farming communities. Organizations like AfriForum carefully track farm murders, which often involve brutal torture, arson, and robbery. These are horrific, destabilizing crimes. However, it is vital to contextualize this violence within the broader macroeconomic data we've been discussing.
Right, because if you look at the data from the South African Police Service and independent researchers at the Institute for Security Studies, farm murders, while brutal, are a statistical fraction of South Africa's massive, overwhelming national homicide rate, which exceeds 25,000 murders a year. The data does not support the narrative of an orchestrated, state-backed political genocide against white farmers. Rather, it points to a catastrophic wave of general criminality driven by the exact structural economic desperation, mass unemployment, and lack of state policing capacity that we've been analyzing.
But the material points out that when violently charged rhetoric enters the mainstream public discourse, the meaning of everyday violence becomes contested. A farm robbery is no longer viewed just as a robbery. It is immediately interpreted through the lens of historical grievance and political intent.
This is where the sociological analysis brings in the analogy of Rwanda in 1994. And let's be absolutely clear. The sources are not using Rwanda as an exact one-to-one equivalence. South Africa is not Rwanda. South Africa has fiercely independent courts, a vibrant free press, a strong constitution, and deep civil society organizations. But Rwanda is used in sociological literature as a pattern warning.
A pattern warning regarding the sociological function of rhetoric. Think about it mechanically. When a state fails to deliver structural economic reform, when the government cannot solve 40% unemployment, cannot fix the township schools, and cannot execute equitable land reform, political entrepreneurs need a new mechanism to mobilize their base.
So they pivot to identity politics.
Exactly. They essentialize a specific demographic group as the sole impediment to progress. It's a highly effective way to mobilize voters without having to offer complex, boring, and difficult policy solutions.
It's a diversion tactic.
It is. Dehumanizing language creates psychological distance. It normalizes fear, suspicion, and grievance. And in doing so, It slowly erodes the shared civic trust that is absolutely required for a democracy to function.
I do want to push back slightly on the doom and gloom narrative here because the resilience of the South African state is actually remarkable. The democratic guardrails have held up against incredible pressure. The courts continually hold politicians accountable. Civil society groups constantly challenge this rhetoric. The society hasn't crumbled into civil war, but it raises a deeply philosophical question about leadership. Does the fact that the courts will step in to stop the absolute worst impulses excuse political leaders from their normative responsibility to actively build social trust?
It shouldn't, because a constitutional court can only adjudicate the law. It cannot legislate empathy, and it cannot mandate social cohesion. If the political arena fixates entirely on adversarial zero-sum identities rather than shared structural policy goals, it becomes exponentially harder to build the multiracial, cross-class coalitions you actually need to pass complex reforms. You cannot fix education, labor laws, and land redistribution without broad societal consensus. Rhetoric doesn't just reflect the mood of a country. It actively shapes the boundaries of what citizens consider to be legitimate political action.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, untangling the mechanics of inequality across four massive economies. Let's synthesize exactly what we've learned. We started with the broken X-ray of South Africa's extreme inequality. We saw how dismantling the legal framework of apartheid did not dismantle the compounding, self-replicating economic architecture of wealth extraction. We saw how relying on unconditional grants and state housing without addressing the structural traps of an insider-outsider labor market, unequal education, and spatial geography left South Africa trapped as a paradox. A miracle of political democracy built atop a volcano of economic inequality.
Then we looked across the globe to see how other nations approach these traps. Brazil proved that you can actually bend the inequality curve, but it requires pre-distribution. You have to combine targeted, conditional welfare that forces human capital development with aggressive, state-managed labor market integration to formalize jobs.
And India offered a stark, highly effective alternative. You can use massive economic growth to fund logistical workfare and food security programs that completely eradicate extreme poverty at the floor, even as you allow an extreme, untaxed oligarchy to monopolize the ceiling.
And China proved that absolute poverty can be eradicated at a civilizational scale, lifting 800 million people through a pragmatic, constantly evolving hybrid of market incentives and hyper-targeted, data-driven state logistics. But they proved that executing this level of structural transformation often requires an authoritarian capacity that sacrifices human rights and ecological stability.
And finally, returning to South Africa, we saw the sociological warning. When high inequality democracies fail to deliver that structural economic transformation, the void is rapidly filled by polarizing identity-based rhetoric that strains the very fabric of democratic consensus.
The overarching lesson, the mechanical truth that applies across all four of these massive nations is this: poverty reduction is fundamentally easier than inequality reduction. Raising the floor is ultimately a matter of state logistics, welfare distribution, and tax revenue. But lowering the ceiling, or compressing the distance between the two, requires fundamentally rewiring the economic machine.
It requires changing who owns the compounding assets, who accesses elite education, and who controls the levers of capital.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Whether you are voting in an upcoming election, analyzing emerging market trends for a firm, or just trying to make sense of the nightly news, keep that mechanical distinction in mind. When a politician or an economist promises to help the poor, ask them the critical question. Are you just raising the floor with a logistical handout, or are you actually going to restructure the machine?
It completely changes how you evaluate the viability of every single policy proposal.
It really does. And I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as we look to the future. A lot of the success stories we analyzed today, Brazil pulling workers into the formal sector, India's IT and service boom, China orchestrating the greatest migration in history from rural farms to coastal factories, they all relied on one fundamental mechanism. They relied on the creation of massive amounts of entry-level manufacturing and service jobs. That was the reliable ladder out of poverty for the global South throughout the 20th and early 21st century.
It was the necessary stepping stone. You move from subsistence farming to low-wage factory work, which provides the tax base to eventually build a middle class.
Exactly. But look at where technology is heading today. With automation, advanced robotics, and artificial intelligence beginning to wipe out those exact entry-level jobs, the call centers, the basic coding, the automated textile manufacturing, how will a nation with 40% unemployment ever find a path to economic emancipation in the 21st century? If the traditional ladder out of poverty is digitized and automated out of existence before a country can even climb it, will that ladder even exist tomorrow?
That is the defining macroeconomic question of the next 50 years. If the old X-ray of inequality was murky, the new one, driven by AI and automation, is entirely blank.
Think about that the next time you hear a simple solution to a deeply complex compounding problem. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.